The truth? I guess I don't even have to say it. Tariffs and trade wars have been all the rage lately, but of course, there are moves beyond this issue. The United States has just announced that it's considering beginning to withdraw troops from Europe, specifically 10,000 troops from Poland and Romania. Yes, in the midst of the war in Ukraine, and with Russia still a threat to Eastern Europe, this is the news.
Pentagon considering proposal to cut thousands of troops from Europe, officials say.
Trumpism is going all out and at full speed. The tariff war against Europe and the rest of the world now seems to be joined by the reduction of US military assistance. Something that, truth be told, we could see coming from the amount of aggressive comments and insinuations against Europeans that we have witnessed recently, especially from J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth, and company. The problem? Well, basically, this idea has already begun to generate internal divisions among Republicans, and we're not talking about the voters, but people at the highest levels. For example, among some senators. But better to hear it for yourselves.
Despite Russia's aggression, there are some who believe now is the time to reduce drastically our military footprint in Europe. This is a viewpoint with which I disagree. I'm troubled that this deeply misguided and dangerous view is held by some mid-level bureaucrats within the Defense Department. They've been working to pursue a U.S. retreat from Europe, and they've often been doing so without coordinating with the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Council. As I have said, Russia is now mobilized for permanent war.
Keep in mind that these words are important because in the United States, in a situation like the current one of fair majorities between Democrats and Republicans, a senator can have more effective power than the president himself. Senators can completely change key executive policies, including tax policy, trade policy, or of course, defense policy. But obviously, if there is concern, even among Republicans themselves, imagine what is happening in Europe on this issue. You will all be aware that a few weeks ago, the European Union announced a plan to mobilize up to 800 billion euros in defense investment. However, until a few days ago, there was nothing concrete about European rearmament. Well, this is no longer the case. The European Union has presented its white paper on defense, in which all the major shortcomings of Europe's defense have been analyzed. A continent where we've also seen news stories like this.
Germany's CDU and SPD reach historic debt deal to jumpstart defense spending. The agreement reached with the Greens would allow Germany to spend up to 1 trillion euros on defense and infrastructure over the next decade.
Of course, not everyone is so sure that Germany and Europe in general will be able to spend so much money on weapons in such a short time. Indeed, much of Europe's military-industrial fabric has shrunk dramatically since the end of the Cold War. Thus, in the case of the old continent, we're talking about an industry that is fragmented into many relatively small defense companies. There are barely a few that are large enough to rapidly scale up production to the levels that would be required. And that means two things: lack of innovation and development of cutting-edge technologies on a large scale, and a lack of sufficient manpower to produce a lot at once. But no matter, even so, Europe has designed a sort of giant shopping list to be able to defend itself without the United States in the future, and also to be able to continue to provide Ukraine with military aid, even in a scenario in which Washington may cut off supplies. And what can I say? It's no secret that in the military field, this is a gigantic challenge, starting with the fact that in Europe, we have seen things such as this.
Rheinmetall CEO, Europe, Ukraine's arms depots are empty.
In NATO exercises, the Germans had serious problems communicating with their allies because their radios were not advanced enough. In 2015, news even broke that the Germans used broomsticks painted black and mounted on armored vehicles to look like machine guns. No, I'm not kidding. This really happened. And even today, they still send military documents by fax instead of secure email systems. And this is just Germany. But very similar news could be drawn from the armies of many other countries in Europe, especially in Western Europe, including those of Spain or Italy, which are more recruitment offices for civil servants than real armies. Even so, not all European countries are in the same situation. Poland, for example, has for some years now been ahead of the rearmament by making multi-million-dollar investments in tanks, howitzers, ammunition, air defenses, artillery, fighters, everything you can imagine, and more. But this and other exceptions, such as the Baltic states, are something like the exception to the rule. Be that as it may, the point is that now, almost suddenly, Brussels has gone from looking the other way on military matters and from focusing mainly on climate change and all manner of regulations to proposing a new kind of military renaissance with this new white paper we have told you about. So here on VisualPolitik, we obviously had to ask some questions. Where exactly does the European Union plan to spend all the money it wants to spend on arms in the coming years? Where does it intend to get the money from? Are the things this plan says realistic? Well, this is exactly what we're going to look at in this video. But first, let's talk about AI and how it's completely restructuring the economy and transforming the value proposition of human work. AI skills aren't just a trend anymore, they're a necessity. Mastering AI tools makes you more valuable, future-proofs your career, and gives you a competitive edge. That's why I highly recommend Outskill's 2-day AI training. It's the world's first AI-focused educational platform, backed by renowned AI investors and AI founders. This 2-day program includes 16 hours of live AI training happening every weekend, Saturday and Sunday, 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. EST. Now, normally this training costs $895, but exclusively for the VisualPolitik community, you can attend it completely for free. Just click the link in the description. In this program, you'll gain in-depth knowledge on various topics, including 20+ AI tools to build AI toolkit, prompt engineering to achieve incredible results, data analysis without coding, using AI in Excel and creating professional presentations effortlessly, building tools with AI without writing code, creating stunning images and videos using AI tools, developing AI agents, automating your work to save time and boost productivity. Professionals from tech and non-tech sectors like sales, marketing, HR operations, and even business owners and freelancers attended and loved it. Over 1 million people from 40 different countries have already participated. This training is for everyone. The number of free slots are limited, so click the link in the description, book your slot. Make sure to join the WhatsApp groups to receive all updates. And don't miss the introduction call for the session on Fridays at 10 a.m. EST.
Objective: fortify Europe.
On the 19th of March, the European Commission presented its new defence strategy for 2030, and this latest EU white paper comes with one very clear message. Europe has to get its act together and rearm itself to the teeth, and it must do so now. Well, in this document, we have analysed. Brussels sets out the roadmap for strengthening its military industry and determines where action needs to be taken first, starting with something that has been a headache for years: the tangle of rules and regulations. It seems unbelievable, but inspired by Mario Draghi's report, the European Commission admits that the bureaucracy they themselves have created is stifling the military industry. As if it didn't suffocate all other industries as well, but that's a topic for another video. Even so, beyond the problem of European bureaucracy, the European Commission has developed other points that reveal the real plans for European rearmament. Where do we start? Well, of course, one of the biggest shortcomings: the stockpiles needs to be replenished. If you were asked what is missing in Europe, whether missiles, artillery, ammunition, drones, what would you answer? Many of you are probably not very clear about this, but rest assured, Brussels has just discovered that everything is missing. More than a decade too late, yes, but well, that's something. We are making progress. Jokes aside, the point is that now, yes, Europe wants to solve the critical shortage of military stocks. Now, this is easier said than done, so the question is, how on earth do they intend to achieve this? For starters, they intend to launch an urgent program to purchase locally manufactured 155mm NATO standard artillery ammunition, and so its goal is to produce and deliver 2 million projectiles per year by 2025. But is this realistic? Well, the truth, a lot has to change in just a few months. Because, just to give you an idea, 300,000 155mm artillery rounds were produced in Europe in 2023, and now, at the current rate, it is estimated that around 1 million could be produced by the end of 2025. Yes, it is a significant increase. Production has tripled in 2 years, but even so, it would have to double again to reach the Brussels objectives. And here is something we have to take into account. Russia is already producing around 3 million artillery rounds on its own, so 1 million among all of Europe is clearly insufficient. It's even laughable when you consider that the European Union represents almost 10 times Russia's GDP. In other words, the 2 million target should be quite attainable, right? The problem is that just one company, the German Rheinmetall, already produces 700,000 of these approximately 1 million projectiles, and the rest of Europe makes up the rest. In other words, the German manufacturer may already be producing at the limit of its capacity. Now, it all depends on whether the others start to deliver, but the truth, we won't believe it until we see it. There have already been been many years of plans that have not come to fruition. Brussels also wants to obtain advanced artillery systems by any means necessary. Although it does not mention specific models, it does mention their characteristics. For example, the plan calls for the production and purchase of artillery systems, such as more modern multiple rocket launchers with a longer range of at least 70 to 300 kilometers. Given these characteristics, some models, such as the French Caesar, the South Korean K239 Chunmoo, the Israeli Pulse, or the American HIMARS come to mind. Although it's possible that, due to the trade war unleashed by the United States and the conflict in Gaza, these last two candidates will not be so prominent in this rearmament.
Brussels also wants member states to stockpile many more missiles, both ground and fighter-launched, with a range of at least 300 kilometers, as is the case with Germany's Taurus. This would allow the countries on the eastern flank, those bordering Russia and Belarus, to have a greater deterrence capability. And of course, taking lessons from the Ukrainian case, there is also an air defense initiative to jointly procure anti-missile and anti-drone defense systems, as well as to accelerate the production of short and medium-range interceptors.
In other words, the plan is to race to create a multi-layered anti-aircraft defense on a European scale that does not depend on US air defenses. Something similar to what Israel managed to develop with systems such as the Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow systems. This would also be the case in South Korea, which has developed its own systems such as the KM-SAM or the newly developed L-SAM, which Europe may even buy directly. However, it's not all about air defense. Here too, a high ground response capability has been established as an absolute priority objective, in this case through the massive assembly of equipment such as tanks. And here the Leopard, or the South Korean K2s that Poland has been betting so much on, could play a crucial role, at least for the time being. And when I say for the time being, because what the plan really seeks is to accelerate the development of the MGCS, the European Main Ground Combat System, the future European tank. This is a Franco-German project launched in 2017 to replace the German Leopard 2 and French Leclerc as the main tanks in the medium term.
In this case, we aren't talking about a simple tank. We're talking about a complete system from which various tanks and attack and defense systems would be developed, from more conventional tanks to unmanned tanks, including new and much more powerful 120mm guns. Also included are communication systems and real-time battle management equipment, as well as active protections to neutralize threats such as anti-tank missiles and enemy drones.
In other words, we're talking about creating a truly advanced ground shock force. The problem? Well, this project might not be completed until 2045. Yeah, that's right, 2045. You heard that correctly. Hence, one of the priorities of Brussels right now is to accelerate this project as much as possible with more funding. And we're talking about public funding, yes, but also private funding, because Europe is seeking to encourage defense companies to invest in these programs as if there were no tomorrow, in order to accelerate this timeline as much as possible. And that can only be done in one way, by guaranteeing sales. That is, guaranteeing that these investments are going to be profitable, because governments are going to buy a lot of equipment for many years. And that is precisely why it's crucial that European countries start signing massive arms procurement contracts now, both for existing equipment and for equipment under development. Otherwise, it could all end in nothing. And unfortunately, we've already seen many military projects filed away in a bottom drawer or with gigantic delays. So obviously, we would not be surprised if many of these plans end up the same way, particularly if European countries are not serious about long-term defense spending. That's where the key to everything is going to lie. The things that are going to make this program work, or be yet another resounding failure. Now, a moment ago, we told you that another of Europe's major objectives is to ensure that military aid to Ukraine will continue to arrive no matter what happens, both for the duration of the war and once the war is over, which is when Ukraine will need to arm itself to the teeth to prevent precisely another Russian invasion in the future. Well, Brussels wants to play on this ground and become the main supplier of all kinds of weapons to Kyiv. In fact, at the end of last year, we were already reading news like this.
AI-enabled HX-2. Kamikaze drones now in production for Ukraine. The German HX-2 will give Ukraine a new way to strike targets at standoff ranges, but also reflects trends beyond that conflict.
Nevertheless, Brussels does not only want to increase the funding of the European Defence Agency, it's also clear that all this money should not only stay within the Union, but should also strengthen Ukraine. How? Well, pay attention. Europe wants to invest in Ukraine, and wants to include it in joint production projects both on Union soil and in Ukraine itself, to turn it into what could be called a kind of defensive porcupine, a fortress that would be so costly to invade again that the sheer cost of doing so would deter Russia from trying again in the future. And pay attention, this could be good for both, for the EU countries and for Ukraine. Look at this.
Ukraine's innovative defense tech sector is the country's trump card.
The potential of the Ukrainian military industry is already absolutely undeniable. Not only has it demonstrated an enormous capacity for adaptation and innovation, but in the midst of the invasion, it has even produced half of all the weaponry consumed on the battlefront. And this at a time when the missiles just keep falling is simply breathtaking. And precisely for this reason, Brussels wants to support the Ukrainians even more and generate many more synergies between the European and Ukrainian defense industries. This is, in fact, another major objective of the new defense white paper. But let's look at a couple of concrete examples. You see, on the one hand, they want to create an air defense initiative that includes Ukraine to speed up the accelerated production of missile interceptors. In this way, Europe would use data obtained during the war, both from detected weak points and from the seized Russian weaponry itself. And it would also use the Ukrainian technology developed in recent years in order to improve it and implement it in new defense systems. It is also proposed to invite Ukraine to participate in the Union's space program and to become part of the Center for Analysis and Exchange of Spatial Information. Take note of this because it would allow joint monitoring of threats and the development of an early warning system, particularly, as to be expected, focused on what Russia might do. And finally, Brussels wants to include Ukraine in the Union's defense technological and industrial base. This would allow Kyiv to integrate into the European military equipment market, as well as to participate in joint projects within the framework of PESCO, which is considered the embryo of a future European army. That is, there would be a constant and huge exchange of military technologies with Kyiv, and a lot of funding that could be used to manufacture weapons in the Union or within Ukraine itself. Because as I said, the idea is to take advantage of all this new, huge military spending that is being sought, not only to arm the European Union, but also to unify armaments and technologies with Kyiv. Of course, hold on a minute, all this may sound wonderful, but it's also expensive. Very expensive. How are they going to implement this massive investment plan? Where will the European Commission get all the money needed? How far will they go with this gamble? Be careful, because everything we've told you is not without risk. So that is exactly what we're going to talk about next. Check it out.
It's now or never.
The plan presented by Brussels covers a lot, and you know what they say, he who grasps at too much loses everything. So the question is, how on earth does Europe intend to finance such a spending plan? Well, let's see. The first thing to understand is that the 800,000 million euros initially planned by Brussels to implement the new defense white paper will not come directly from Brussels' coffers. In fact, the financing plan has two parts. On the one hand, an EU direct lending facility of 150 billion euros. In other words, the European Commission is going to offer loans to member states, enabling them to finance part of their purchases of military equipment and supplies. And what about the remaining 650 billion? Where will it come from? Well,
if member states increased their defense spending by 1.5% of GDP on average, they could create a fiscal space of around 650 billion euros over a 4-year period.
Well, in many cases, they will be deficits. Brussels' idea is to make the various countries increase their defense spending, and that this new spending does not compute in the fiscal rules. In other words, any excess defense spending will be deducted from the deficit targets. States will thus be able to spend 1.5 points more of their GDP exclusively for defense, without this counting against their deficit and debt commitments. Doing so, they will be able to increase military spending without Brussels giving them a slap on the wrist. In theory, this easing will allow larger countries, such as Italy, Spain, and France, to invest much more in their military industry. But it also raises questions about how this will affect the EU's financial stability, because naturally, the figures presented are spectacular for marketing purposes, but the truth is that this number only materializes if national governments increase defense spending out of their own pockets. In other words, Brussels would only lend 1/5 of the money announced, and the rest, well, let the countries manage to pay it back. For example, this is nothing like the Next Generation COVID recovery funds. In the Next Generation funds, more than 400 billion euros were non-repayable grants, and some 385 billion more were low-interest loans. In other words, 150 billion in loans, versus $400 billion in non-repayable funds. Can you see it? Even in a situation like this, and when everyone is saying that defense is now a top priority, the European Commission's plans are actually quite timid. Certainly much more so than the disastrous Next Generation plan, which, truth be told, as we already told you over on Visual Economic, it amounted to practically nothing. And what can I say? It is concerning. This rearmament plan and its economic endowment have been announced with great fanfare, as if it were a macro plan from Brussels. However, you only need to scratch the surface a little to see that a large part of it is pure smoke, at least as far as money is concerned. And that again brings us face to face with a reality. Military spending is much less versatile for the politicians in office than other types of programs, and that makes it much less interesting. For example, to give you an idea, Spain was the country with the second largest next generation funds allocated by COVID, totaling some 140,000 million euros. Well, in Spain, these funds have been used to a large extent for things that have absolutely nothing to do with the recovery from the effects of the pandemic or with productive transformation. They have been used purely and simply for political purposes and to pay perks. For instance, some of the money has ended up in the expansion of ski resorts, rehabilitation of housing to make it more environmentally friendly, or even for digitizing the Camino de Santiago walking trail. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, because with defense spending, this cannot be done. In fact, this probably explains why this time we're talking about 150 billion in loans from Brussels, and with Next Generation, we were talking about 400 billion in non-repayable subsidies. Plain and simple, for the politician on duty, there is not that much business. But on top of this problem, there is also another one. And that is due to the fact that each country wants to protect its own arms manufacturers and ensure that multi-billion-dollar defense contracts stay at home. This may sound logical to some extent, but it has serious consequences. As we've already told you, defense companies in Europe tend to be small, have much more limited markets, and much less capacity for innovation than the giants of the United States or even South Korea. This poses many limits because it reduces economies of scale and makes armies more complex and more expensive to operate and maintain. You could say that when you're talking about hundreds of small companies, you can't produce the mega investments that we see in US industry, and that essentially means less R&D and less cutting-edge weaponry. That is why we can find ourselves with a lot of money, but invested in a much more inefficient and much slower process, which is exactly what should not happen.
This is the big risk. If we simply funnel money into our existing, highly fragmented defense industry, it could become wasteful and inflationary. The key is consolidation, fewer models, larger scale production, and real collaboration between member states.
VisualPolitik community, if Europe wants all this spending to serve a purpose, and if the famous defense white paper is to be implemented, a coordinated plan is needed to specialize the industries of each state. That is to say, to concentrate the production of specific equipment in certain countries in order to gain volume. Or you could also opt for a model of large Airbus-style consortia, where major European companies set up production plants in several member states to specialize, cooperate with each other, and then share the economic benefits. However, it's not all doom and gloom. Some believe that this plan may be the boost Europe needs. The logic is simple. More defense spending can lead to more production, more employment, and more innovation, at a time when the European economy seems to be stagnating in these areas. However, this entire chain is ultimately financed by taxes. In other words, by extracting money from other productive sectors that may, in turn, be logistically affected. The military industry is an industrial machine that basically depends on government money, and that can easily become a case of bread for today and famine for tomorrow. And that is why it is crucial to spend wisely and encourage synergies with other private productive sectors of the economy, something that the United States, Israel, and South Korea, for example, have been able to do very well. And even China. And this will also be another of the key factors that will define the success or failure of this enormous European Union defense plan. But while all this is becoming clearer, VisualPolitik puts the questions over to you. Will Europe be able to rebuild its military-industrial fabric to rearm by the 2030 deadline? Will the various governments be willing to do their part? Or will it all fall on deaf ears as soon as the fear of a possible Russian attack passes? Well, leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. And more importantly, if you like this video, go ahead and like it, and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. It's free, and it helps us out a lot. As always, thank you very much for being there. All the best. I'll see you next time.